It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Starring the indestructible John Hersey and the irrepressible Andrew Bernstein. I am Andrew Bernstein, and you are indubitably John Hersey. How you doing today, John?
I'm fantastic. It's the day after Thanksgiving. Ate lots of good food yesterday. I'm feeling good, and I'm very happy to be talking today about great literary hero. And of course, we're speaking today with Dr. Shoshana Milgram about Victor Hugo. How are you doing today, Andy?
I'm doing great, John, and I think we should welcome our guest on today, the inimitable Professor Shoshana Milgram from Virginia Tech's English program. How are you doing today, Shoshana? Welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Andy and John.
It's great. It's great to have you. And Victor Hugo is a literary immortal. I think we all love his novels. I know I've loved Les Misérables and 93 for a number of years, and I know you're an expert on Hugo, having lectured on him and written on him. So it's great. It's great to have you on to discuss Hugo's life and his achievements. So John, I'm sure you have some questions for our guests. You want to dive in?
Yeah, absolutely. So Hugo, I think, is probably best known for his Les Mis and his Hunchback of Notre-Dame. And I'm just curious what you think are some of the qualities that made these books stand out both in their time and then also continue to this day.
Okay, so the question is, why were his books appealing in their time and now? Well, for one thing, I think that a lot of the reasons are the same, because Victor Hugo is known for saying that if he wrote only for his own time, he might as well break his pen and throw it away. So he's writing for all time. And of course, many writers say that, but I think he actually meant that because one of the things I like about him as a writer is that he's not modest and that he's after big game and that he sees himself as being equal to that. So in fact, a lot of the reasons are the same. And the reasons I think preeminently are that we're here on the Hero Show, is that he loves to portray human greatness. That's his subject. And what greater subject could that be? Greatness in the sense of, what are the qualities of character that would enable a human being to do great things? He's very interested in individuals. Now, sometimes people talk about him in the sense of, social ideas and his vision of society and so on. But, well, for him, it's always this one and this one and this one more than everybody together. Now, of course, he's not someone he's writing before Ayn Rand. He's also not someone who was an original thinker in the sense of what is a proper moral code, what should a society be. But what he did understand, and I think, profoundly, and this, of course, makes him a great writer, is that to be a great person, one needs to think. It doesn't happen by accident. And so that's his subject. He looks from the inside and the outside at human beings doing great things. And again, that's a wonderful subject. Now, what I didn't mention yet, and I should mention, is that in addition to being the great writer of the human soul, he's also a great plotter in the sense of a complex narrative in which he's got suspense. He's got many different elements put together, and you can't necessarily figure out ahead of time what he's going to do with them. But, he's got all the balls in the air that he's juggling. He's got all the threads that he can pull together. And then he pulls them all together in order to highlight what great people can do. Now, he's got villains too, and he does them very well also, because after all, they're part of what contributes to making the story and the conflicts and the struggle and the battle interesting. But he features great people, not always where you might expect to find them, not necessarily on the basis of superficial attributes. And then he puts them in challenging situations and shows them achieving a kind of spiritual triumph. So again, who wouldn't want to read a book like that?
I certainly want to. You know, Shoshana, there's an emotional quality in Hugo's books that I've never experienced in any other writer anywhere ever in my entire life. It's just a sense of grandeur that's just, it's matchless. It's just extraordinary. And what did Ayn Rand say, that the sense of life level reading Hugo made her feel like she was entering a cathedral? I mean, you know,
Yes.
I mean, that's exactly right. His sense of human stature, of the human potential, is just, it's astonishing, and in and of itself makes me love his books. Never mind the plot, never mind the brilliant plots that, like you're saying, that he developed. He really is extraordinary. I mean, in my experience, he's sui generis because of that. There's just nobody like him, and I could see why Ayn Rand considered him the greatest novelist in world literature. I consider Ayn Rand the greatest novelist of world literature, but I can see why she thought Hugo was.
And, you know, as we're talking about it, I realize that some people might not have read the books and that we don't want to necessarily spoil the surprises. And he's really good at surprises. And the way that he works his surprises is that you don't see it come, you don't see the surprise coming before it's there. And then once it's there, oh, he's been working toward this, he's been preparing toward this the whole time. So he's terrific at that. And I think I'm going to try hard not to reveal things that people shouldn't know, but just, you should know that if you're reading, it's to your advantage to keep track of everybody, because he doesn't just throw in people for local color, or because he's, I don't know, interested in description, or because the person he knows, but because he's going to draw all the threads together. And when you just said that about human stature, one of the wonderful things is that he can find human stature in unexpected places. I'll tell you what, one of my favorite little bits, and I think it's just terrific, is, I mean, we all love the character of Gavroche from Les Misérables, okay? And Gavroche, and by the way, if you only know him through Les Mis, which is a fine musical, but if you only know him through Les Mis, you're missing out on a lot of that character, because Gavroche is actually the child of the Thénardiers, those evil people.
Right.
So part of what we have there is that you don't have to spring from good people in order to be good yourself. He's contrasted with them, and they are genuinely evil. They're not just funny rogues. They're truly evil people. But Gavroche, he's truly good, without being bombastic or pretentious, but just, a generosity of spirit and a joy in life. And in Les Misérables, he adopts two other children, two boys he sees, and it turns out they're his brothers, and he doesn't even know that. And he takes them under his wing, he protects them, he gives them a place to stay, and he feeds them. And much later in the book, the two of them, the older one protects the younger one and says to him what Gavroche said to him in giving him some bread. He says, put that in your gun, put that in your muzzle. And one of those brothers says that to the other one. Again, so we've got the great people, and then we've got Gavroche, who was also great, but in the pint-sized version. And he's inspirational to the two boys, and one of them is now the junior Gavroche and can carry on. So it's as if we've got, a family or a fraternity, not necessarily by blood, although in this case they are, but the Thénardiers are not like them, in which people can be inspired by each other and learn from each other and grow from each other. And again, there are other great scenes like that, that I don't want to, there's a famous one in Les Misérables.
Shoshana and John, we should set the time and place. Hugo's dates were what, 1802 to 1884. Was that it?
85.
I think it might 85.
85. Okay, 1802 to 1885. Now, I'm going to ask you something. Is it right? Was his father was a general in Napoleon's army?
And his mom was on the other side.
Yeah, his father was an atheist and a Republican, right? And his mother was a devout Catholic and a royalist. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think they didn't agree in other ways too. So you could say, in a sense, that he came from conflict. It's funny when you mention about his being born in 1802, because he used to say I was born with the century. And sometimes people try to make themselves younger than they are. But he liked the idea of sitting on the century and that this is my century. And Ayn Rand did that with Howard Rourke. She gave him birth on the century. Howard Rourke is born in 1900, so he's 22 when it's 1922. And I don't think she necessarily got that from Hugo, but it's interesting that from his point of view, he should have been born at the beginning of the century because that sort of fits his idea. And all the way through in his, his thing of his own life and in his fiction, he wanted things to come out the way that they, in a sense, artistically should, which is not to say that he's a liar, but that he's a stylizer. And it's not the end of the world. I mean, obviously, you don't want to get your passport in the wrong date, but that from his point of view, it's easier to keep track if he's born, the century and I were born together. And as far as his parents, I think that he had a sense of he early learned that people can have feelings for each other and yet not agree, and that leads to strife, which it did. He also, I think, uses that in his fiction later because Marius comes from a divided family.
Right.
Okay. And, and that's part of Marius's story. And Marius is a lot like Victor Hugo in that he's got one set of thoughts and then he learns more and then he can grow as well. As far as thinking about setting Victor Hugo in time and place, you can do that, but I have to say I have trouble even remembering everything without notes. I mean, he wrote so much and he lived through, that's a pretty long life, lived through so much that if I start trying to summarize without notes, I'm probably going to leave something out because he's the great triple threat in literature. And he's maybe the greatest poet. Actually, I think it was André Gide said that about him. Who's the greatest poet in French literature? And he says, Victor Hugo, hélas, alas, which is a way of saying that he's not his type of poet, but that he can't argue with the fact that Hugo was the great poet. I think that he's the great novelist, and each novel is, they're all wonderful, but each one's somewhat different. And as far as the plays also are very dramatic and stylized. And I think you could argue for his being, there's Racine and Corneille, of course, are great. What happened with Victor Hugo is that his plays got censored. And so, what are you going to do? Keep writing plays and have them close them down? What he said is, I'm writing novels now. That's the theater that's never closed. But he's got some claim to being, the great playwright and the great poet and the great novelist. And he's also got a period where he's a public figure and he's a politician and he's even an artist. I mean, you could look at his drawings and they don't look like anybody else's drawings. So it's he's got enough life for 10 people, enough art for 10 people. And I guess he lived a long time, which means for some people that means that they've outlived their talent, but he was still doing good work, pretty close to the end. And it's all of a piece. People sometimes joke about Shakespeare, the good plays and the bad plays or whatever, but I don't really think that you can look at Victor Hugo's writing and say, well, that's the bad stuff, because he's always all in. He brings all of himself. Even the writing that he did as a teenager is of a piece with his writing. There's something funny he said, I don't know if I can quote it exactly, but it was with the idea of collected works. Should he, samplings from his writing? And he said, what would you do? Go to Mont Blanc and bring back a pebble? On the other hand, it is true that from going to Mont Blanc, bringing a pebble, you get some idea of what the mountain is, especially if it's a really great pebble. And so I think you can look at one of his poems and bring back everything from that. But from his point of view, it's all good and it all counts and we need it all. So I'm glad that we have as much of him as we do. And I think even some of his unpublished writing has been brought into print over, over time. And so there's more Victor Hugo published now than in his lifetime, and that's for the good.
Yeah, I heard that something like a third of his works were unpublished at his death.
Yeah. Including, cool stuff and, notes that he wrote and drafts and ideas that he had that he didn't necessarily complete. In Les Miserables, this is not a spoiler. In Les Miserables, for example, Fantine has friends who were, with her before her, when she's, a happy young woman, involved with a young man, and there are 3 others who are friends of hers, and they all go on a picnic, etc. Well, Victor Hugo had ideas for bringing the 3 other friends back later in the novel, and that they're associated, with various other stages in her life. And he ultimately didn't write that, but it's as if in his mind they were all part of he knew what they were up to. He knew the rest of their story, and so he's selected from this whole universe that he knows what he's going to include in there. So he's the best. He's the best in that even what he doesn't publish is also interesting and is part of the same world. It's not as if he thinks, oh, that was a mistake. No, that's not a mistake. And he wasn't troubled with some of his writing was not appreciated by other people. That didn't lead him to think, oh no, what did I do wrong? Instead, it's more a matter of what did they do wrong?
Right.
Yeah.
From what I was reading, Les Miserables, as it came out, was very popular amongst.
Oh boy!
But it was panned by the critics. Is that right? The contrast.
Well, some didn't like it, but many did. I guess one story that sort of sticks in my head. Flaubert,
Sure.
Madame Bovary. Okay, well, he had another novel that was supposed to come out right around then, and the publisher said maybe we should wait and publish your book after the fuss. So I'm just saying, but he did not have appreciation for Les Miserables. It wasn't his sort of thing. Yes. And he said as much. So that's one that's sort of in my head. And I don't think it's just because it was the book that meant that his Misérables couldn't get published on time, but it wasn't his type of fiction. But I think whenever a writer is extremely successful, there might be some envy setting in, as if something couldn't be both popular and good.
Right. Right.
Which, of course, is not true. I mean, what kind of judgment is that on the reading public if you think something couldn't be both popular and good? I'm just saying.
Hugo and Flaubert and Zola, I mean, they were in different universes. I mean, they're writing about different human beings. It's like, they're like different species. The characters of the French realists and naturalists and naturalists generally are, very small. Yes. Maybe everyday life, some cases smaller than life. Hugo's writing about giants. I mean, it's just
giants even when they're kids.
Right.
Yeah.
And the emotional power that Hugo generates. Like I said, I've never experienced it in any other writer. You were mentioning Fantine, and that deathbed scene. And this doesn't give away the end of the story. But when Jean Valjean's promising her to take care of Cosette, I mean, I'm just sobbing, when I read this scene. The pathos of it, it's so genuine. You feel for Fantine, but the benevolence, of Jean Valjean and the way he keeps his promise through hell and high water to take care of her daughter, and it's just beautiful. I mean, it's just this is what human beings really can be like. They can be like this, and sometimes they are. And Hugo is writing about what's really important in life. The human potential.
It's really important. What's interesting, of course, is that he does have some conventional characters, and sometimes things even go well for them, but you can absolutely tell the difference between the ones he's genuinely invested in and sometimes the conventionally appealing characters are shown to have deficiencies, including that they don't really appreciate the heroes in their lives, sort of thing. The handsome young man in Notre-Dame who doesn't appreciate Esmeralda. Just saying, you know, and so Victor he can do that. It's not as if everybody needs to be a giant, but he differentiates between the people who have that greatness of soul and the ones who don't. And things, and it's not as if he's giving out happiness in the practical sense, in the immediate short range sense, you know, for happiness for the good people and punishment for the bad people. No, it's more a matter of what their souls need and whether they're going to get to have that purity of an emotional experience, which is what the great people want. I mean, that's one of the things about Fantine, is that, you know, her love for Cosette is all encompassing.
Right.
And
right.
She never has this moment when she thinks, well, why did I do what I did for this little kid? No, it's, she never questions that, because for her, that's an important value and she's dedicated to that. And I think that's part of what we see with the characters. They don't laugh at themselves. They don't the great ones. They don't diminish themselves. And Victor Hugo has respect for them.
And Hugo's theme here, you know, in Les Misérables, where, you know, he's showing the injustice heaped upon, you know, society's lower classes by the aristocracy and the upper classes, and yet it's the lower classes. You don't really get a sense of victimhood from them. So many of them have such spiritual grandeur that it's just very different from the Marxist view, and the Marxist view that so dominates, you know, the intellectual culture today, where they're real victims and they're helpless. Hugo's lower class people who are treated unjustly, they have such dignity of spirit. The greatness of soul is a nice phrase that you use, Shoshana. That you know, it's just so different. It's just such a different view. You know, they're definitely unjustly treated, no doubt. But you just get the sense of their own inner emotional strength that you don't find, you know, in the post-Marxist.
Absolutely. Which is, of course, why we care about them. You know,
right.
we care about them because of who they are in themselves, not because of what's done to them. Anybody can be a victim.
Right.
You know, bad people can be victims. You know, that being a victim doesn't automatically guarantee our interest, but we're interested in them because, you know, they have values, they have people, they have causes that they care about. And it's not as if Victor Hugo thinks that the wealthy are automatically evil either. Just, you know, I mean, Jean Valjean, by his own efforts, he's a businessman, you know, and he can make use of his wealth, and that it's not as if somehow he gets corrupted by having money.
Right.
You said that one of the things he does is he can find sort of spiritual strength in places where you wouldn't think to look for it. And it strikes me that he's just able to see humanity wherever he looks so much more than the average writer, who sort of gives us a characterization of a certain person, but doesn't view them with real respect. I think there's another word that you used. You also mentioned that he was the triple threat in literature: a poet, which I think is what he's most known for in France, a playwright, and a novelist. And as a playwright, I know that he had a big influence in catalyzing the Romantic movement. I think we should talk about Ernani and you know, the cultural context of that and what happened as a result of that play.
Yeah, well, I think that he certainly enjoyed that, and I mean, it was one of those, I guess you could say, you know, scandals or adventures of literature that it was called the Battle of Ernani, because he violated the conventions of French dramatic theater. He has as he put it in a poem afterwards, I had a king ask what time it is. You know, in other words, mixing the high and low level. And the audience could see that this was someone who was not following the rules and yet doing a very dramatic story. Now, I think it is true that his plays are well plotted, and they're and the language is very good, but they're not, and and conflicts of values and so on, but they're not as great as the novels from that standpoint, which is why I think well, I mean, some of them have been turned into operas, which is good, but the operas do not just use his language; they heighten it with the music and so on. But yeah, no, he was well, for one thing, he's breaking the rules. For another thing, they're very exciting, and for a third is that he sometimes is getting a little anti-monarchic feeling in there, and that's a fine thing to do, except when you've got a monarch with power over you who can shut you down. And so sometimes he would try to change the time frame so that it wouldn't seem to be an attack on the contemporary monarch, but of course attacks on totalitarian power are going to be attacks regardless. I think part of what I like, I guess, about the plays, is that it's as if he goes into the plot thinking, let's see, what can I do to make things worse for the character?
Right.
Yeah. And yet I think because it's a play, maybe it can be helped in performance. He doesn't have as much time to establish the emotions and the process, and it all has to unfold in front of you. And that's a challenge. I think the novels are just nothing else. I mean, Ayn Rand's novels, of course, are very great. And she admired Victor Hugo, so there's actually something in common there, except of course she's got a better philosophy. But some of the very good things that we cherish in Ayn Rand are there in Victor Hugo already, including the fact that everything is to his purpose. And that's even true for what she called the commercials, the digressions. And she says, well, they're fine on their own. Well, I think one doesn't necessarily have to read them through every time one reads the novels, but I think it's a matter of interest. Well, why is this here? Why is this here? One of the things that he said about the Waterloo digression in Les Misérables, he said, well, maybe you don't have to read it, but I had to write it. And it's as if a way of saying, well, this is an important part of the conception. And without spoiling, it has both a philosophical purpose, the Waterloo digression, and also a plot purpose, which I won't give away. Okay, there's, it all adds up to a certain point, which is interesting to us. But philosophically, the point that he makes about Waterloo, which is wonderful, he said that historians will talk all day long about Blücher and all the different things that happened that contributed to Napoleon's loss. And he says, no, that's actually not what it is. What it is that he had annoyed God. And it was time for the great plotter to take a hand and make things come out the way that they were supposed to. Now, of course, it's a sort of a way of saying that God's a novelist, and that the plot has to correspond to the way the values are supposed to be. So, that's his idea of God as a novelist. And I think in a way, he's the novelist and he's the God of his book. And that he's going to make things come out the way that they're supposed to, as opposed to accident. And that's why what is sometimes called coincidence, it's not coincidence, it's purpose. And he sets it up. So that was, that's a point about Waterloo. It also it was a plot point too, and it grounded the story. It revisited the question of the Napoleonic conflict, his parents, and his own thinking about that issue over decades. Who was Napoleon, and what was he, and why do we care? So I think he's always good. That's why when I have taught the book, I do ask the students to get a full whatever translation, it should be complete. And
Right.
if they're going to skip it, okay, they go ahead. You can't stop them from skipping, but I don't want to skip things for them, because that's not the way that Victor Hugo wrote it, and that's not what he wants.
Well, let me ask you about the translation, Shoshana, because I know Ayn Rand said she thought in French, the original French, the writing is just stunning, and she wasn't pleased with the English translations. I know was it her writing class where she translated, parts of Hugo herself. Now, you're fluent in French, is that right? You read Hugo in the original?
Well, I can read. I have a bad accent, and when I'm actually in France, they make fun of me. So I wouldn't. I'm just saying, I wouldn't exactly say that I'm fluent. Well, I even had a story. This really happened. I was in a bookstore in Paris, and I had a certain kind of book that I wanted. An early 20th century periodical, and how it was published in novel form. And the head of the book, the person in the bookstore, listening to me, said, "Well, what do you want with a book like that? You don't know French. If that's all you can do." But I was speaking grammatically, just had an accent, and so he was discouraging me. And then and he said, "No, I don't have any of that anyway." And I looked up and I saw that the book was up there on the top shelf. The kinds of books I was looking for. And I said, "Well, how about that?" And he brought the books down, and I looked and I saw that, in fact, the one that he had there was one I already owned. So I didn't buy it, but he could have had a customer,
Right.
and was sending me away. Now but again, so I read, but I'm not fluent.
But
And
the translations into English.
Well, they're
Bad, but do you have a special translation that you prefer of any of Hugo's novels?
Well, what I usually do in sort of trying to decide is I read them aloud in English and see if they sound like poetry, just if they've got a rhythm to them, and also if they're complete. I've not done a study of every single translation, but if it's complete and if it sounds, there's a rhythm to it, it sounds marked, not ordinary, then it's pretty good. I don't like using translations that are partial. Just
I know, like the Hooker translation of Cyrano is
that's great.
beautiful. Is there any equivalent translator of Hugo?
Well, there might be in poetry, because Hooker translates it as poetry. What I've found is generally an older translation will be less inventive, which is probably good. But some of the early translations, also the British ones, they were uncomfortable with, say, the first English translation of Notre-Dame was uncomfortable with the powerful sexual references in that novel. And they said, that's French, that's not for, we're British. And so Claude Frollo says that he's in love with Esmeralda, and he said our savior would have preferred to be born of her.
Wow.
Yeah. And there's more, and so the first English translations did not render that sort of thing. That's too French for us. But the older translations, they do tend to have everything there, and French wasn't such a hard language that they couldn't do it.
Right.
I guess it's also, I'm so trying to think of, with my, or when I'm looking for a translation, I have to, if I'm going to teach it, I need to find something that's either free or in print,
Right.
rather than something that would be hard for the students to get. And so I go for accessibility, and then I bring my own books and look at them. And if there's something important that this has been missed, then I'll try to make a point about it. But you were mentioning Ayn Rand, and that is so interesting that she could have translated everything. I guess then she wouldn't have had enough time to do all the other wonderful things she did. But she did do a translation of the beginning of L'Unequaled, the man who laughs. And what was interesting was that it was, pretty literal. And she did not know all of the words, because Hugo sometimes has unusual words, and then she would leave a blank for that. But nonetheless, it still sounded more like poetry in a good way.
Right.
And she rendered, I'm going by memories, but I think he had Gens de l'Esprit, which could be rendered, people of the spirit. And she rendered that as the men of the mind, which I think works fine. Just saying, I mean, that actually is a good translation of that. And it's not creative in the sense of being a distortion of what he wrote. So she did a nice translation. I think she was shocked to see that some translations are clumsy or left things out, either because they wanted to be shorter than the original, or because there was sexual material that they didn't want to deal with.
Well, you mentioned that Hugo was something of a god of his universe, and it just seems, I'm sure it would really irritate Rand and other fans of Hugo to come to this universe and see that key pieces of it are missing. So.
Yeah, well, I think so. He also himself did not know English well, and so it wasn't his task or something that he was interested in to go through the translation. So he was just glad they were getting done. And of course, in his time, a lot of British people could read the French, British, Russian, and so on. So in fact, he didn't need to depend on translation for a lot of his audience. In America, not so much. You couldn't, that things had to be translated for them. But the books were translated fast because there was a market. And Les Misérables, that book people have been waiting for a long time. And he had been writing it for a long time because he interrupted it to go into exile. And,
Didn't he write it over like a 15-year period while he was in exile?
Well, not quite as long as that, but the key thing is that there was a big break, that he was writing it in France, and then he's leaving unexpectedly, and apparently it almost tipped out of the boat. So sort of thing. And he wrote down in the manuscript, and it's the scene where Jean Valjean reads the correspondence between Cosette and Marius and realizes what's going on. It's what the blotter told. And he wrote down, this is where the peer, PER of France stopped writing, and where the exile began. Just that. So that was the marker. And he also, when he picked it up again, he had to reread and get himself back in the frame of mind. And then, of course, he writes it, makes a fabulous deal for getting it published. And it's his wife was in Paris and was reporting to him on how things were going, with people just battering down the doors of the bookstores, and the bookstores being worried that they weren't going to be able to keep the customers out because they wanted the book so much. So yeah, very, very, very big hit.
Now, I wanted to ask about his life. He was exiled for years. It was because of his political principles, because he was a Republican in politics, and he was stood up against the monarch.
Something like that, yeah. And other people who'd been protesters were invited back, and he didn't want to go back as soon as he was invited, because he didn't like this. He didn't like the regime, and didn't want to go, and he delayed his return, I'll put it that way. And then when he came back, there were continuing problems with the communards. And in general, I have a little trouble making good sense out of his politics, except that he always knew, he didn't hesitate. And I think that maybe for not necessarily in a good way, he would jump for what he thought was right. He always thought he was standing up for justice. He thought he was standing up for fraternity. He thought that he was, in favor of good things. I think that he was probably naive and uninformed, and so not always right. And I guess from the standpoint of looking at him as a writer, I think he would have written even more if he hadn't gotten mixed up in politics. But from his point of view, he's got the prestige of his reputation and what seemed to him to be important. But he was always going to side with the side that he saw as being, I guess, the defender, advocate of human beings and of human treatment.
Right.
He fought against the death penalty, fought for free public education, things like
which
that.
Again,
right?
these are views that he has, which are not necessarily, well, what I would think.
Right. Yeah, we
free
should
public education. Yeah. I mean, I'm in favor of education, but not free public education. And, you know, he wouldn't have had the grasp of why that's not a good idea, you know, for everyone else to be compelled for some people's education.
Well, Hugo is a magnificent, you know, literary artist.
Yes.
He's not a philosopher. He's not Ayn Rand. So we we understand that. But let me ask you. So his years in exile on the Channel Islands, did that experience contribute to Toilers of the Sea?
Oh yeah, yeah. The sea. You know, you could see it from his window. You can see pictures, and I mean, you can see, you know, pictures of what his view would have been like. And so there he is on an island, and he writes The Man Who Laughs also. English setting. And I think he is said to have enjoyed aspects of that, although he was always, you know, he did not learn English well. And so, for example, if he writes about Shakespeare, it's not going to be from an intimate knowledge of the English language and appreciating Shakespeare as a user of language, but more from the standpoint of the ideas. But yeah, Toilers of the Sea, that's in there. And I think the exile in The Man Who Laughs, you know, the Clan Charlie, the father of Gwynplaine, you know, that's the sort of description of the exile and walking the shores and so on, that comes from his experience in Guernsey. I've never been there. I see pictures, you know, and someday I want to. I've been to his earlier house, in the Place des Vosges in Paris, you know, in the Marais area, but I've been there a couple of times, but I've never been to Guernsey, and I would like to just be there and walk in that house and walk where he walked and see what he saw. I think it was obviously better for him to be there than to be in prison, and he was, you know, so it was a kind of a refuge, and he tried to, you know, appreciate that and do good things in the community for children and that sort of thing.
Right. Now, I want to ask also another aspect of his long life. Is it accurate to say that he fought a two-front war, you know, in literary aesthetics, against the neoclassicists of his youth and then against the realists and naturalists later on in the 19th century, fighting romantic literary principles?
Well, you could say that. And he did do some writing about that sort of issue, but I think mostly he was just doing what he wanted to do without being worried about the enemies.
Okay.
You know, just, I mean, that, I mean, he was interested in Scott, for example, you know, wrote kind of a piece about Quentin Durward, and he thought, oh, that's, you know, because he could see that Scott was interested in heroes and in history, and he was interested in heroes and history. But as we know, Scott doesn't always make his heroes really exciting. Often the heroes are the least interesting characters in the book. And for Victor Hugo, it wasn't going to be like that. So
I have a very difficult time getting through a Walter Scott novel. I have to say, I find them very boring. But yeah,
well, there's always good things in them, you know. And I mean, Scott probably wrote, well, you need to choose. Yeah, I mean, I like a lot of Scott, but proportionally, I guess maybe not as much. I think the Bride of Lammermoor is an interesting book.
On this,
well, you know, let me ask one more question, John. Mm-hmm. When I was in high school, Shoshana, they still read Ivanhoe. You know, they still had a reading list.
Oh yeah.
But, you know, but the point I want to make here, the question I want to ask. So, high school to me was very boring. So I used to stay up half the night, you know, and watch the Late Show, the Late Show, on CBS. And I remember seeing The Life of Emile Zola. I think Paul Muni was in it.
Mhm.
And I'm just a kid. I've never read, any
Yeah.
or even Hugo yet. And at one point, you see he's a starving writer, and the romantics are popular. And he says, and he takes the book. I don't know if it was Hugo or Dumas or whoever it was. He said, he throws it into the fireplace. He says, burn the books of the liars to keep an honest man warm. And so years later, I read Hugo and I read Germinal, Zola's novel, and I recalled that scene, and I said, to myself, Emile, you're entitled to your opinions, but I would vastly rather read Hugo than your books. His idea of honesty was this kind of verisimilitude where you just follow the lives of people as they actually are, as opposed to what they might be and ought to be, as Aristotle put it. So I could see, So Hugo wasn't concerned to argue against the naturalists, and he just kept writing in the romantic genres.
I think that's over. I mean, look what he spent his time on. I think that's overall true. That the notion of a bad review would not get in his way. I think that a comment from a publisher about, I don't know if we should do this, he'd have to argue with the publisher. But the thing about Zola in that movie, as I remember it, is that it wanted to give him credit for the Dreyfus affair, which you could say that could come from a Hugo novel, just someone standing up and using his pen, because Hugo also wanted to use his pen in defense of things that were important to him. And for Zola, it was a matter of associating himself with an unpopular cause. So, and I think that's a true story, that Zola did actually do that. It's also true, Zola talked about his writing as being almost scientific in the sense of, a lab report on society. And, a lab report on society is a lot less interesting for many of us that we're looking for art.
You're right. I know John has questions for you, but I just want to say real quick, Zola is a hero, in his own life, and in standing up for Dreyfus, which I think you're right, is historically accurate. His literary approach is just not my cup of tea.
Mm-hmm.
I know John had some more questions.
I wanted to add just on the conflict with classicism. Have either of you read Kay Nolte Smith's A Tale of the Wind? This is an excellent novel, and it spans most of the romantic.
Oh yeah.
Movement. But there's a passage in here that I just wanted to read because I think it's relevant on this conflict with classicism, and I don't think it spoils too much of the novel. It's just a paragraph here, but the character's name is Jean, and I won't say much about her. But so this is describing opening night of Ernani and at the Comédie Française, and the factions that grew up around both the classical, I guess we'd call it dogma, classical dogmatism about propriety and what's propriety of both content and form in literature, and the romanticism that Hugo was helping to catalyze. And so it says, "Vive Hugo," Jean shouted, and saw with sudden clarity that the shouting, the struggle, indeed the whole night, were about something much larger than Victor Hugo or even the theater. At stake were not just rules about a play, but ways of living. Was the past always to be sacred, as those graying, disdainful men at whom she was shouting would have it to be? Was one always to do things as they once had been done? The old men had created the world into which she had been born, and had not created it well. They had destroyed a revolution and restored a king. They would keep her as she had begun, a ragpicker's daughter. They hated the change and the freedom. She laughed and shouted more loudly. "You are the appalling ones, not us. Vive Ernani." Or Ernani.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that book does create the ambiance of that time period. It's also true, and I think I can explain this without taking forever. Part of classicism had to do with, was based on the good idea that it's good to have a plan. Okay, it's good to have unity and focus, you know, time, action, place. I mean, it's in Aristotle. And that it's not good to let everything hang out. It's sort of the way that ballet has a discipline, which you don't necessarily see in other forms of dance. And, you know, ballet, okay, is what it is. You know what you're getting when you're getting ballet, and it's not easy. Okay. However, I think that from Victor Hugo's point of view is that he wanted to have his own kind of unity, which would not necessarily be based on everything having to happen in one day. You know, there still needs to be a kind of unity of action. And so it's almost as if classicism was a good idea, but it didn't understand what made the good idea a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
There's intrinsicism.
Yes, yeah. I think that's, yeah, that's a way of looking at it. And so when Victor Hugo, as he put it, you know, I had the king ask what time it is, and from the classicists, this would look like naturalism, because after all, kings have to brush their teeth and all that sort of thing. But for Victor, it's more a matter of, well, if I want the king to ask what time it is, then the king's going to ask what time it is. But I'm not just doing it in order to show off that I can do it. That particular example is in my head, by the way, because he wrote a poem about it. I mean, he wrote a poem about this. It's a response to an active accusation. And he's, you know, sort of standing up for what he did. But I think it would be mistaken to see him as a diminishing of him, to see him as anti anything.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah,
although, you know, although if he gets attacked, you know, he'll speak up, but, you know, he's got better things to do.
I think Smith too is sympathetic to the qualities of classicism, because in this book, she of course describes this basically sloppy mob of people that really, you know, they're eating sausage and throwing their wrappers around in the theater and making a mess. And the classicists are, you know, they think that's repugnant. And I think that's a, you know, somewhat sympathetic description of the classicists in that case, because who wants to really associate with who end up being the heroes of the story, but who really takes pride in what they do there? I don't think too many.
Yeah, it's interesting, by the way. Hugo sometimes attacks mobs. You know, he's got the faceless mob. He's opposed to that. And I'm just saying, people sometimes don't look at those passages, but he was troubled and frightened and disapproving of the idea of, you know, the mob as such, people doing something as a group that they would not, bad things that they would not do as individuals.
Yeah, and that comes out in 93 quite a bit.
Yes.
And even when he's being sympathetic, he's portraying a set of people he's sympathetic to. He's not doing it in a way that is very sympathetic. If it's a
now of course when you go to The Man Who Laughs, and again without spoiling it, he does indict those who were in power, but it's particular people who are in power who do bad things and who need to be called to account for that. So it's not as if it's always that he's going to praise the low over the high, just as if being low is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're saying before about being victim isn't enough to make you good.
There's
neither necessary nor sufficient. Yeah.
He seems to be very objective in his assessment. Obviously, he wasn't always, but you know, he is able to see both the good and the bad in people who are overall good and overall bad, and be
which isn't the same thing as saying that we all are some kind of mishmash, but just, you know, that's who that person is. That's who that person was at that point in time, and it is what it real. You know, is what it is.
One of the things that's so literarily powerful of Hugo is the way he could put his main characters in internal conflict. You know, they're not just in external conflict, but, you know, like, again, we don't want to give away the plot here, but in 93, which is a book that I personally love, you know, the character Simordain, is that how you pronounce his name? The ex-priest, he's got to pass judgment on the only, which could be the death sentence. He's in a situation where he's got to pass judgment on the only person he's ever really loved in his life. And he's a man of the utmost moral rectitude, committed to justice. And so Hugo puts his characters in these situations where one way or the other, he's gonna, Simordain is gonna take a blow. Reminds me of Howard Rourke in the courtroom scene in The Fountainhead, where Rourke is either gonna, his best friend is either going to be crushed, or Rourke's going to go to prison. But either way, Howard Rourke's going to take a blow. And this is really great writing. It's really sad that Hugo was not appreciated, or Ayn Rand for that matter, is not appreciated as much as they should be in the literary world today. The great plot structure when you get your character in internal conflict as well as external conflict. I don't know of anybody, in my experience, Shoshana, who does it better than Hugo.
Well, 93 is terrific because he's got
really
several different characters whom he's put in those situations. I mean, Simordain is in that spot because Gauvin was in a spot of having a conflict and having to decide. And
Right.
Gauvin was in his spot because Lontenac was in a spot of having to decide. And so it's as if, we've got a cascading set of conflicts, and there isn't, there are different answers that each character could achieve. Now, I think what is true is that for Victor Hugo, for a character to die is not a defeat. And sometimes, in fact, for a character to die is, an affirmation of a choice. And that's, which I think you could say that's tragic, because why shouldn't people be able to choose right and live good lives? But I think that for him, the characters who get to survive often are the ones who never were put in a spot like that.
Right. And, Ayn Rand, if I remember correctly, she wrote an introduction to 93. And I know she wanted to help bring Hugo to a wider audience in the English-speaking world. And I hope, on a smaller scale, I hope that our show today can, reach a lot of people and convince people that if they haven't read Hugo, or they've read him only sparingly, to read more of him. Because if anybody who loves literature, especially well-plotted literature about heroes and great characters, I mean, Hugo is just, he himself is a giant. He could be a character in one of his own stories.
I think that's true. I was thinking just of, when you describe the different characteristics of a hero in your book recently,
Mhm.
that, that he fits very well. The one that there might be a question about is, because he's not a philosopher, or all of his values and achievements in favor of doing things that will make human life better. Would we have a better world if we went to Victor Hugo for advice on that subject? And I think, to be fair, as he would be if he were writing about himself as a character, you'd have to say, well, not exactly. But I think that to the extent of his knowledge, he does the best that he can. He's not evading, he's trying, and he's wishing to understand. And also, in a sense, it's as if the world is his novel. And
we have a much, much better world because of his novels, not because of his politics. But
yes, that's true.
We would not want to be without Hugo's novels, and I know
Right.
if Ayn Rand were here, we know what she would say.
Yes.
About that. So yeah, I think Hugo's a hero. Well, that's why John and I want to have him on the Hero Show, and wanted to discuss Hugo with you. So, what do you think, John? You have some more questions for our guest?
Yeah, I have one more, which, this is a very selfish question, but hopefully it'll benefit our listeners too, and they'll take interest in the answer to this. I'm wondering, Shoshana, if there's a book of his poetry that you think is his best, and perhaps even a translation that you think is among the best. I read French, but I'm a bit rusty.
Well, I tell you a book that I have that I got something from, and it's a book edited by Marva Barnett, who's just written a book on Les Misérables that I am not right now recommending, but it's Victor Hugo on the things that matter.
Hmm.
And she has a lot of poems in there and selections from his writing. And to tell you the truth, she's got very good notes. I don't think she translated everything. Maybe there aren't even translations, but I just don't quite remember. But I remember, I got that book and there were things in there I had not seen before, but that I was very impressed by. So that's what's kind of good about it, just from someone, is that she gives a lot of information. And that's good information to have. Sorry, I just need to hit that. So I like that. And then there's a book called Selected Poems of Victor Hugo, and I think it's University Press published it, and I think it has facing, and that's pretty good too. Just in the sense of that'll give you some great poems and some English that'll help you. And Marva, I think it's called Selected Poems, and I think that Marva Barnett's book, even if she doesn't have translations, she's got information. And some of those poems you could look for, or you could make your way through them. Oh, yeah, some of them are really very, very beautiful poems. And so that's what I would say is for an English speaker, that those would be two books to look for.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm definitely going to have to track those down.
And thank you for being on the show, Shoshana. I think, yeah, it's great having you on to discuss Hugo. And I hope that people, if they haven't read, if they know Les Mis only from the Broadway musical, which is very good. I mean, I like it a lot, but it can't possibly be a substitute for the novel. And I hope more people will go out and read the full Les Misérables, not the abridged version. Read 93, which is a great novel. I hope our show, Shoshana and John, I hope our show today will inspire a number of people to go back and rediscover, read or for the first time or reread Hugo, because he's truly a literary giant.
Yes.
And so,
well, I mean, a life with Victor Hugo in it is going to be much richer than a life without.
Well said. Well said.
So, yeah.
Definitely. All right. Well, thanks for being on the show, Shoshana. It was great having you on.
Thank you.
And I want to salute Victor Hugo and wish everybody to have a more heroic day. And I hope everybody has a more heroic life. So we'll be back next week, John, with another hero.
We shall. Talk soon.
Okay.